Picture this. You are a Roman soldier in Arabia, around 25 BC. The sun is not rising anymore, it is directly overhead, and it has been there for what feels like hours. Your armor is not protecting you, it is cooking you. The metal pulls heat from the air and holds it against your skin. Your mouth is dry in a way that feels permanent, like the moisture has been scraped out and replaced with sand. The animals ahead of you are stumbling. Not dramatically, not all at once, just that small, terrible forward lean that means their legs are working harder than they should be. Your guide says the next water is close. He said that yesterday. Now shift the scene a few hundred miles east. A Bedouin caravan is crossing the same kind of desert. Same sun, same sand, same silence. But the pace is different. The animals are not stumbling. A rider reaches toward one of the female camels and draws milk, not water from a skin, not the last of the supply milk, warm and fresh, from an animal that has not seen a well in days. Nobody looks panicked. Nobody looks like they are calculating survival. They look like people who are traveling. Rome had the most powerful military machine the ancient world had ever produced. It had defeated armies in Britain, in North Africa, in Mesopotamia. It had crossed the Alps. It had engineered roads through swamps. It had fed and moved legions across 3 continents. And yet, in Arabia, the desert did not need to fight it. The desert just needed to wait. According to Strabo, the Greek geographer who accompanied the expedition and left us the most detailed account we have, the Roman force under the prefect Aelius Gallus set out around 25 to 24 BC with thousands of Gaul soldiers, orders from Augustus to explore and possibly subjugate Arabia Felix, and every expectation that Roman logistics would handle the terrain the way Roman logistics handled everything. They had a guide, a Nabatean named Sylleus, who knew the region. They had water-bearing camels on part of the march. They had a functioning military supply system. They had the full weight of imperial confidence behind them. By the time the survivors returned to Egypt, most of the force was gone. 7 men died in combat. 7. The rest, most of the army, were lost to disease, thirst, heat, and the grinding mathematics of trying to keep Roman animals alive in a landscape those animals were never built to cross. The desert did not need to fight, it just needed to wait. So what exactly happened? The simplest answer is that Rome brought the wrong animals. But that answer is too easy, and it misses the real mechanism. To understand why the Roman animals died, you need to understand what those animals actually required and what Arabia had no obligation to provide. A horse is a powerful animal. It is fast, it is strong, it carries loads and riders across enormous distances, and it has served armies for thousands of years. It is also, in the context of a desert campaign, a water emergency waiting to happen. A horse at rest, in moderate temperature, needs somewhere between 25 and 55 liters of water per day just to function. That is baseline. Add heat, add load, add movement across sand and rock in summer sun. A working horse in those conditions can sweat through 2 to 4 gallons of water per hour. And sweating is not optional. It is the horse's primary cooling system. Remove the sweat and the horse dies of heat. Keep the sweat running and the horse empties itself from the inside out. In a landscape with no rivers, no predictable wells, and distances between water sources measured in days of travel, the math was not complicated. It was lethal. Every horse in that army was a demand on a resource the desert was not supplying. Every mule was the same calculation, and Rome brought thousands of them. Now compare that to a Bedouin caravan covering the same terrain. The Bedouins were not carrying water for their animals. They were carrying animals that carried their own. Here is where most people make the first mistake. Ask anyone what a camel stores in its hump, and the answer comes fast: water. It feels obvious. It matches the story. The hump is the secret reservoir, the biological canteen, the reason a camel can cross the desert while a horse collapses. It is also wrong. The hump is fat. Pure energy reserve, not a tank, not a bladder, not a water storage organ in any form. A full hump on a healthy camel is a sign of good condition, the way a well-fed body carries reserves. When a camel is depleted, the hump shrinks and tilts because the fat is being metabolized, not because the water is draining. The water story is a myth. and it has been a myth for a long time. But if the secret is not in the hump, where is it? It is in the blood. Most mammals have red blood cells shaped like round, slightly concave discs. Under normal conditions, they circulate easily, carrying oxygen through the vascular system without friction. But dehydration changes blood. As the body loses water, blood plasma thickens. And when blood thickens, round cells start to have trouble moving through the smallest vessels. Circulation slows. Oxygen delivery drops. For most large mammals, horses, oxen, humans, dehydration that reaches roughly 12 to 15% of total body water becomes dangerous and quickly fatal. The blood becomes too thick to move efficiently, and the system starts to fail. A camel's red blood cells are not round. They are oval, elliptical, and that shape does something that sounds simple but changes everything. Oval cells orient themselves along the direction of blood flow. Even in thickened blood, even as the plasma becomes viscous and slow, those cells align and keep moving through capillaries that round cells would struggle to pass. The camel's circulation does not fail at the point where most mammals begin to die. It keeps working. And there is more. When a camel finally does reach water and begins rehydrating, those oval cells can expand to roughly 240% of their original volume without rupturing. Most mammal red blood cells can manage about 150% before they burst. This means a camel can drink an enormous quantity of water rapidly, somewhere between 95 and 200 liters in a single session, and absorb it without the kind of cellular damage that would kill most other animals from the shock of rapid rehydration. The body fills back up fast, and it does not break in the process. The camel does not stop there. Rather than sweating continuously to maintain a fixed body temperature, a camel allows its core temperature to rise through the day from around 34 degrees Celsius in the cool morning to as high as 41 degrees in peak heat, absorbing the environmental warmth rather than burning water to fight it off. When the night cools, the stored heat releases. The camel has essentially used its own body mass as a thermal buffer. It sweats far less than a horse would in identical conditions because it is not constantly fighting to hold a fixed temperature against the environment. It is negotiating with the heat instead. Add to this kidneys that produce urine so concentrated it has been described as almost syrupy, a digestive system that extracts water from waste before excretion, and nasal passages that recapture moisture from exhaled breath. And you begin to see the shape of something that is not a storage system at all. It is a conservation system. Every mechanism points in the same direction. Do not waste what you have, move through the desert on less, stay functional for longer, and drink deeply when water finally appears. A horse needs the desert to provide water constantly. A camel needs the desert to provide water eventually. That is not a small distinction. In Arabia, it was the difference between an army and a caravan. But here is what the biology alone does not explain. The camel's body is remarkable, but a remarkable body is not a crossing, turning a biologically efficient animal into a functioning desert journey with loads, with timing, with families, with trade goods, with animals in different conditions, and a route that has to actually reach water before the margins run out. That is something else entirely. That is operational knowledge. And that is the part Rome never had, never built, and never understood it was missing. The Bedouins knew something that Rome did not, and it was not a secret they were hiding. It was knowledge they had accumulated across generations of living with a specific animal in a specific landscape, knowledge so embedded in daily practice that it did not look like knowledge at all. It looked like routine. Start with the most basic misunderstanding. The idea that a camel is essentially a desert horse, a more patient horse, a more durable horse, a horse that needs less water. This framing gets the animal completely wrong. A horse is a speed and power system. You push it, it responds. You need distance covered fast, it covers distance fast. Roman military thinking was built around that logic. Cavalry, supply lines, rapid movement, decisive strikes. The horse was the engine of ancient warfare and ancient logistics, and Rome was very good at using it. The camel does not work that way. Push a camel beyond its sustainable pace, and it does not simply tire. It breaks down in ways that are slow, expensive, and in the middle of a desert, catastrophic. A camel's value is not speed. It is range. It is the ability to carry a significant load across terrain that would destroy a horse in hours, at a pace that can be maintained for days, using water at a fraction of the rate. The intelligence in using a camel is not in how hard you can push it. It is in how precisely you can match your expectations to its biology. Bedouins understood this in a way that was not theoretical. They lived it. They knew when a camel was approaching its limit before the animal showed obvious distress. They knew how to load it, so the weight distributed without injury across a long march. They knew that an overloaded camel on day 1 becomes a collapsed camel on day 3. And a collapsed camel in open desert is not a logistical setback. It is a reduction in everything: load capacity, milk supply, and the margin between a manageable situation and a fatal one. And here is the detail that separates Bedouin practice from Roman thinking most cleanly. The Bedouins had horses. They were not using camels because they lacked access to better options. Arabian horses were among the most prized in the ancient world: fast, lean, bred for exactly the conditions of the region. Bedouin raiders rode horses. Combat required horses. Speed over short distances required horses. The horse was not unknown or unavailable. It was simply not the right tool for a desert crossing, and the Bedouins knew the difference. 2 animals, 2 functions. You do not take your combat horse into the deep desert any more than you take your pack camel into a cavalry charge. The choice was engineering, not poverty. Rome brought one animal category and applied it everywhere. The desert charged the full price for that mistake. Now here is the part that sounds almost too convenient until you understand the mechanism. A lactating camel, a female camel producing milk, can continue producing milk even when she herself is water deprived. Not indefinitely, not without limit, but for periods that would stop any other dairy animal completely. Documented accounts of Bedouin herders describe surviving extended desert journeys sustained almost entirely on camel milk, with no other food source and limited access to standing water. This was not a cultural story about endurance. It was a biological fact being used with precision. Camel milk is not just fluid. It provides protein, fat, vitamins, and calories alongside hydration. A traveler drinking camel milk is not simply replacing water loss. They are eating and drinking simultaneously from a single source that is walking alongside them, carrying part of the load, and not requiring its own water stop to keep producing. The caravan was not carrying a water supply. The caravan was carrying animals whose bodies were the water supply, and those bodies were also the food supply, the load carrier, and the navigation anchor. The camel was not the vehicle. The camel was the infrastructure. If you have ever carried a heavy pack on a hot day and felt how quickly your water consumption accelerates, how thirst builds not from temperature alone, but from exertion, you have a small physical sense of why this matters. A human traveling on foot in desert heat needs significantly more water than a human resting in shade. Every kilogram of load carried increases that demand. The Bedouin system addressed this from multiple directions at once. The camel carried the load, reducing the human's exertion and water loss. The camel's milk replaced some of the fluid the human still lost. The camel's pace dictated a movement rhythm that minimized unnecessary exertion. The whole system worked together. Remove any one piece, and the margins tighten. Which brings you to timing, and this is where outsiders made their most consistent mistake. Roman military logic prioritized speed. Cover ground quickly, reach the objective, secure the position. Speed was dominance. Speed was discipline. Speed was how you stayed inside the enemy's decision cycle. In a European theater, in a Mediterranean campaign, in terrain that had roads and rivers and forested hills that cooled the air, this logic worked. In Arabia, it worked in reverse. Moving through open desert at midday in summer is not fast travel. It is accelerated dying. The sun is directly overhead, shade is minimal or non-existent. Ground temperature radiates heat upward at the same moment the sky is radiating it downward. Every animal, every human, every water skin in that column is losing moisture at a rate the supply cannot replace. The faster you move, the harder the animals work, the more they sweat, the faster the water disappears. You can push through midday and cover more distance and arrive at the next point with animals that are hours from collapse rather than days. Bedouin caravans moved at dawn. They moved in the evening. In extreme heat seasons, experienced desert travelers moved at night, using the stars and the cooling air, resting through the worst of the day in whatever shade could be constructed or found. This was not laziness or lack of urgency. It was the understanding that time itself was a resource, and spending it badly cost water you did not have to spend. A day of disciplined rest, in the right shade, could mean the difference between arriving at the next well with animals intact or arriving with animals already failing. Silius, the Nabatean guide who led Gallus and the Roman army through Arabia, understood this completely. According to Strabo's account, he directed the Roman column along routes that extended the march through waterless terrain, maximizing exposure exactly when the Roman logistics system was least able to absorb it. The Romans could not counter this because they could not read the desert themselves. They had no independent way to evaluate the route, assess the distance to water, or recognize when the march timing was working against their animals. They were dependent on a guide who was deliberately using that dependence against them. The knowledge gap was not just an inconvenience, it was the weapon. A caravan that knows where the wells are, which ones hold water in which season, and how many days of careful travel separates each one. That caravan is navigating a map. A caravan that does not know these things is crossing blank space and hoping. The desert looks the same from both positions. The outcomes are completely different. Bedouin navigation was not mystical. It was accumulated, transmitted, tested, and refined over generations of people whose lives depended on getting it right. Dune formations that indicated wind patterns, gravel plains that marked ancient watercourses, specific plants whose presence suggested moisture below the surface, star positions calibrated to known routes, the smell of the air shifting toward water, the behavior of animals when they sensed it, wells whose locations, conditions, and seasonal reliability were held in memory and passed down as carefully as any other form of inheritance, because to a desert traveler, that knowledge was inheritance. It was the difference between a viable route and a death march. And layered over all of this was something that modern observers tend to categorize as culture and therefore set aside from the survival analysis: hospitality. The obligation to shelter a stranger, offer water, provide protection for a defined period, regardless of prior relationship or tribal allegiance. To an outside eye, this looks like generosity, maybe like an ethical tradition, maybe like social performance. In the desert's actual logic, it was infrastructure. There are no permanent roads in open desert. There are no inns, no emergency services, no predictable resupply points controlled by neutral parties. A traveler moving through unknown territory is dependent on the people they encounter. A traveler who can call on the hospitality code has access to water, food, information about conditions ahead, and temporary protection, things that in the desert are not comforts but operational necessities. The reputation that allowed you to claim guest rights tonight was built by the hospitality you extended last month. The information a guest carried into your camp about a dry well 2 days east might save your herd next season. The social web was not decorative. It was the distributed network that made movement across large distances possible without permanent infrastructure. A cup of coffee poured for a stranger was not a gesture. In the mechanics of desert travel, it was a signal. You are recognized, you are protected, the rules apply to you here. Without that signal, a lone traveler in unfamiliar territory was invisible, and invisible in the desert means unassisted when something goes wrong. Rome had nothing like this in Arabia. It had supply lines that required fixed points. It had logistics that assumed a landscape that cooperated. It had animals that needed the desert to provide what the desert did not provide. And it had a guide whose knowledge of all these systems was the only thing standing between the army and total disorientation. A guide who was using that knowledge against them. The Bedouin system worked in the opposite direction at every level. The animal was matched to the terrain. The pace was matched to the animal. The timing was matched to the temperature. The route was built from accumulated knowledge passed through generations. The social network provided access to resources that could not be carried. And no single part of this was the answer. Not the camel's blood cells alone, not the milk alone, not the timing alone, not the oral geography alone, not the hospitality code alone. Every layer reinforced the others. Take any one away, and the system weakens. Take several away, and you have the Gallus expedition. Rome's army needed the desert to cooperate. The Bedouins built a system that worked whether the desert cooperated or not. If this story made you rethink what advanced actually means, subscribe. The channel is full of history that surprises you. Go back to that Roman soldier from the beginning. He is standing in the heat, watching a Bedouin caravan pass in the distance. He is looking at camels and riders and loaded packs moving steadily across terrain that is destroying his army. And from where he stands, it probably looks simple. An unremarkable procession, animals that look ungainly, a pace that looks slow, nothing that resembles the military precision Rome had perfected over centuries. He does not see the oval blood cells maintaining circulation in thickened blood. He does not see the body temperature rising and falling in slow negotiation with the heat rather than fighting it. He does not see the milk already sustaining the riders, the load distributed so no animal breaks before the well. He does not see the route held in memory across a dozen generations, threading precisely between water sources spaced days apart. He does not see the social obligations that opened the last camp to a stranger and sent him onward with information about conditions ahead. He does not see any of it. It is invisible to him because it is not carried in equipment. It is carried in knowledge, and knowledge, unlike armor, does not show. The desert had not changed. The camel's biology had not changed. The wells were where they had always been. The same stars crossed the same sky on the same schedule. The Bedouins were not crossing a different Arabia. They were crossing the same one with a system so precisely fitted to that landscape that what looked like ordinary travel was actually a form of engineering refined over centuries by people who could not afford to be wrong. You thought the camel was the secret. The camel was the foundation. The system built on top of it, the pace, the timing, the milk, the routes, the social codes, the generational knowledge of when to move and when to stop and where the water waited and who would give it that was what Rome did not have and could not improvise. The Romans had the mightiest army on earth. The Bedouins had something harder to build, a system that knew how to lose water slowly. If you've made it this far, hit subscribe. Every video on this channel is built the same way. Real history, real mechanisms, no filler.